It's good to have you here. And we have a great guest, David Hunt from the Aristotle Foundation. I wasn't able to get him for the morning here live, but I did a pre-record with him. So I'm going to go ahead and play that and then come back live at the end to have any closing comments. So with that, I will proceed and get that rolling here. Hello, folks and Canadians, and I just want to introduce to you here David Hunt. He's our guest speaker today, and he is the Research Director for the Aristotle Foundation for Public Policy in Canada. David has deep and wide experience, including as an entrepreneur, business consultant, and as a director of education programs. David has published over 12 peer-reviewed research studies, written dozens of columns, hosted multiple forums on education, given dozens of speeches on education-related topics, including on the benefits of school choice, and has been widely interviewed by the media over the past decade. 3 of David's research papers have been submitted as evidence and/or referenced by experts in court or court submissions, including to the Supreme Court of Canada. David also teaches occasional courses at the Melville School of Business at Kwantlen Polytechnic University. David holds a Master of Public Policy from Simon Fraser University and a Bachelor of Business Administration with distinction from Kwantlen Polytechnic University, where he was the Dean's Medal recipient. David shepherds all Aristotle Foundation research from the idea stage to publication. Born and raised in British Columbia, David and his wife and children live in Metro Vancouver. When not at the beach, David and his family regularly hike and ski in beautiful British Columbia. Welcome, David Hunt. Tell us a little bit about the Aristotle Foundation and your role there.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me, Doris. It's quite the intro. So the Aristotle Foundation, it's a brand new think tank based out of Calgary. Although I'm still in Vancouver, the think tank is based in Calgary. And if I could back up for 2 seconds, just what is a think tank? Because I find most people, 9 out of 10 people don't know what a think tank is. So where a think tank operates is at the intersection, or if you're English, at the roundabout of government policy, academic research, and then public narrative. So on a variety of issues, what you're attempting to do as a think tank, whatever the think tank is you're trying to take the best research out there to move the needle on public policy, and very often the theory of change around that is to move the needle on public conversations. You want to get media coverage on your studies and get your stuff out into the public. So Aristotle, why this think tank was founded is that there's so many issues that other think tanks aren't diving into. And so take topics like DEI, systemic racism, cancel culture, attacks on our founding and history, the attack on free expression and free inquiry, assaults on our shared humanity, identity politics, mob behavior, all that sort of stuff. And of course, the education system and its, dare I say, toxic wellspring of anti-individual, illiberal, and anti-reality ideas. So where's the research to push back on all of that, and research that's public policy oriented to, again, move the public conversation so that governments, regardless of the political party, like whoever's in power, to hold them to account, say, no, here's the research. If you actually want to push back on racism, you actually want a society where every person is respected, well, DEI is not the way to go. And the language around systemic racism, like Canada is not a systemically racist country, and here's the evidence that that's not the case. So it's those kind of issues, a lot of spicy stuff, but we're doing solid research where my intent is that it's always bulletproof, where it's irrefutable. Here's the evidence, and let's combat anti-reality ideas in the public square.
Wow. You're a busy guy. Those are really, really hot topics and very, very interesting. So as we roll into the survey, tell us about how the survey came to get started and show us everything you know about it.
Sure. Yeah. So the research I'll present today is from the previous think tank that I was at until quite recently. Excellent organization called Cardus. And so the research I'll jump into is called the Cardus Education Survey. And I'll pull from a few other studies that build off of that or feed into that. And what the Cardus Education Survey looks at is the graduate outcomes of various different types of schooling. So whether it's, of course, public school, whether it's independent or private school, or various types of religious schooling or homeschooling. And in terms of what are those graduate outcomes moving beyond just simply academic outcomes, because you have pretty good data on that from government sources and from standardized tests and whatnot, but looking at other outcomes such as citizenship, cultural, civic formation, and civic engagement. So how are different forms of education shaping culture? Also looking at family formation. Which graduates are the most likely to be married and have kids? That matters for a society big time. Also looking at religion and for very specifically something like Christian schooling, the motivations for parents when it comes to Christian schooling, typically what's driving that decision is reinforcement of the faith. They want their kids raised in the faith. So then it's a very valid question is, do Christian schools produce Christian graduates in terms of who they become as adults 10, 20 years after the fact? So those kind of questions, which of course no government survey would ever dive into, that's where the Cardus Education Survey adds a lot of value. It's highly credible work. You've got scholars that don't believe in anything we believe in that will cite this work simply because there's nothing else like it out there, and the methodology is sound. So scholars at Harvard University, for example, citing it, and to put it in context. So I think the sample size, this is before this last year. So there's currently an edition that's about to come out, brand new data, should be coming out later this year, early 2025. But before that, the sample size was 18,001 respondents. So 18,000 respondents in Canada, the United States, and Australia. And this is a representative, reliable sample, randomly selected. So yeah, and of course the methodology, you want to dive into that, all stuff's available, and this is all publicly available. You can get it online.
That's awesome. I've seen your survey before. I've watched you present, and it's always interesting and really noticeable how well homeschoolers are doing. But would you take some time now to show us the actual survey and to comment on each sort of category?
Sure,
and,
sure.
Yeah.
Yes, let's jump in. Let me share my screen. Just 2 seconds here. Share. Here we go. And what I'll do, just let me click present, and then swap the presenter view, so that hopefully is what you're seeing, Doris.
Yeah, looks
who
good.
has the biggest influence? Okay, perfect. Who has the biggest influence on students? So I always like to, so if we could back up a tiny bit, I always like to start here, just to put everything in context. So a question I would ask any audience is, who has the biggest influence on students? And of course, solicit whatever the audience response is. And sometimes you get a variety of answers, but usually audiences get it right. And of course, homeschool audiences definitely always get it right. As mom and dad, as parents. Parents definitely have the biggest impact on students. And if you jump into, there's quite a bit of literature on this, but one of the most robust studies looks at gigantic data set of hundreds of thousands of students across dozens of countries. And this is an economist writing this. And economists, of course, always want to find a hard metric, a proxy to be able to measure whatever it is they're after. So in terms of predicting academic outcomes, what proxy is the best measure of that? And they found books in the home was almost a perfect predictor of how well the student would perform in terms of who's in the top quintile of the class, who's in the bottom quintile of the class. So a household that has 200 or more books, it's almost a perfect predictor that that student will be in the top quintile of the class. A household that is fewer than 10 books, again, almost a perfect predictor, that student will be in the bottom quintile of the class. And of course, an economist is not going to then get into the qualitative interpretation of that and why might that be. But I think you and I can use a bit of intuition and put it together that a home that's filled with books has a certain atmosphere where there's learning is in the air, so to speak, and there's a culture of learning, there's a culture of inquiry, and it's very likely mom and dad are reading to the kids, and all that has a profound impact on students. So that's ground zero for all of this. Is mom and dad are the most important ingredient. Yes, by nature they are the first educators of their kids, but also even as kids grow beyond, say, 3, 4, 5 years old, mom and dad still are the key determinant, the key variable in terms of the success, the academic success of young people. So a study that initially opened the door for me at Cardus was a study around who chooses independent schools and why. And although this isn't related to homeschooling, it's a good segue in that the reason parents are choosing independent schools and thus choosing to not put their kids in public school is that they're looking for a supportive, nurturing environment. They're looking for a safe school. They're looking for something that develops character. And this we find with the homeschool community is often very similar. Of course, the main thing they're looking, if they're most who are in independent schools are religious families. So they're going to a Christian school or a Jewish school or an Islamic school. Why? To reinforce the faith. So again, as I just mentioned, the Cardus Education Survey is all about, well, what happens to those kids as adults if they go to the Christian school? Do they actually become Christians as adults? And of course, there have been over 40 Cardus Education Survey studies. All this is available online. So let's jump into the most recent Canadian data. So if we ask let's start with the religious questions and how we'll present this. This is a little bit academic ease, so I'll try to break it down. The red line that you see where the zero is on the axis, that's your benchmark. That's public school grads, or those who either graduated from public school or did the overwhelming majority of their schooling at public school. Who are they as 24 to 39-year-olds? So roughly 6 to 22 years out of high school. Who are they as adults? Who do they become? And so the benchmark is public schoolers. And so with all the other categories, whether it's your separate Catholic schools, your independent Catholic schools, and of course that's in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Ontario. Here in BC, you only have the independent Catholic schools. Whether it's your non-religious private schools, which tend to be either specialty schools like Montessori or STEM or special ed, or they may be elite, top-tier schools. That's your non-religious category. Then keep scrolling down, you see evangelical, and this can be a contentious label. I know, simply because I was giving a presentation on, what was it? It was in Edmonton. I was presenting to whatever this audience was, and the pastor who was hosting the presentation comes up to me after and says, "Well, where are we in the data?" I said, "Well, aren't you evangelical?" He says, No, we're Protestant." So I'm like, oh, okay, splitting hairs here. So in previous studies, the label was Protestant. For whatever reason, that didn't resonate, so we changed it to evangelical. There isn't a perfect label. So all of that is under that basket. And again, it's those who went to your Christian schools, like Regent Christian Academy or Surrey Christian, Vancouver Christian School, those kind of schools, right? So those who either graduated from there or did their overwhelming majority of schooling there. And then the bottom two categories, which are the most relevant for this podcast or this webinar, are homeschool, religious homeschoolers. And then what you see right below that are non-religious homeschoolers. So delineating between those two. And then in terms of these numbers on the bottom, so we have our benchmark, but then if you see a 1, that is a standard deviation. So this is fancy stats terms. If we think of a normal distribution, so a bell curve, where typically if you take any random sample of a large amount of people, most people, whatever it is we're exploring, whatever it is we're researching, most of them will cluster around the middle. So whether it's the mean, the median, or the mode, whatever it is we're referring to as our average or our middle point. So whatever middleness is, most will cluster around that. So typically in a normal distribution, roughly 2/3 of people are somewhere are within one standard deviation of the middle, either below or above average, within one standard deviation. So why that's important is because once a data point moves beyond a standard deviation, once you move beyond that initial big hump, that's what you would call a statistically significant finding, where we're a full deviation away from the middle point. So you're outside of the average, that big hub. So that means once you get to 2 standard deviations, you're moving way beyond that. And if you're at 3 standard deviations, you're in the far tails of those data points. So you are just a sliver of the population, because of course this is based on like if you think of it as a pie chart, this is out of a whole. So wherever you see homeschoolers, so for example, as an adult between the age of 24 to 39, when you have to make moral decisions, do you turn to God or Scripture in order to make that moral decision? So we have a raw score here, which is the blue dot, and then you have, I think it's 38 or 39 variables we controlled for to isolate for the school sector effect. Because, of course, as a good social scientist, what you're trying to do is measure, does the schooling in and of itself, so homeschool, does the fact that you homeschool, does that in and of itself, irrespective of the family you're a part of, the church you go to, the neighborhood you're in, does homeschooling in and of itself make the difference? What is there a homeschool effect? So what you see here is if you just have the raw score, you're at 2.5, almost 3 standard deviations from the mean. And even after all controls, you're at almost 2 standard deviations. So the likelihood, if you're a religious homeschool family, the likelihood that your kids as adults will turn to God when they have to make a moral decision is almost 2 standard deviations beyond the public school grad who comes from the exact same background as your kids, goes to the same church, lives in the same neighborhood. Because again, we've controlled for all those factors. So that's the homeschool difference. So now if we look at the confidence in terms of religion, there's a decimal here that's hard to see, so you don't have a standard deviation here. So whatever you're seeing, that this is just noise. This is not statistically significant. It could be anomalous. So now let's move on to, were you prepared for vital religious or spiritual life as an adult? And again, you're at, the raw score is a full standard deviation, with controls is a bit below that, but still compared to all other school categories, homeschoolers, religious homeschoolers, are the most likely to feel as adults they were prepared for critical, important religious and spiritual life, which again, that's huge. For me, as a homeschool parent who wants to raise my kids to love the Lord, that's one of the most important things. I mean, if not, it is the most important thing. Okay, moving on. Obligation to regularly practice spiritual disciplines such as prayer or reading the scriptures. Look at that, a full standard deviation after controls for the religious homeschoolers. Now, again, if you eliminate controls and you include family and all the other factors, you're beyond 2 standard deviations. So there's more going on than just homeschooling, but the homeschool effect in and of itself gives you a full standard deviation, and they are the most likely as adults to be praying and reading scripture regularly. Okay, you have an obligation to the church. Again, a full standard deviation and the most likely of any school type. What about church attendance? Again, they're the most likely as adults, and if you isolate for all effects, the only one, so all the homeschoolers, you have a full statistically significant difference there, and then also your independent Catholic schoolers. But the most likely are, again, your religious homeschoolers. So do you have an obligation to accept the authority of your church leadership, if there is any? Again, you got a full standard deviation. Do you have an obligation to obey the church or church authority, your pastors and whatnot? Again, a full standard deviation after controls. What about tithing? Is there an obligation to tithe? Again, not quite a standard deviation, but almost. But the more important question, do you actually tithe? Well, there could use a bit of work, and the effect that is there clearly is more. It's another factor, not homeschooling. Maybe it's family background of the church you go to or whatnot. Although very interesting that those who were raised, I had never noticed this before, those who were raised in a non-religious homeschool environment, if they are adults who are I'm assuming beyond Christians, maybe Jews also tithe. I don't know if other religions tithe. we'd have to get into the data in terms, but I'm assuming if you respond to regularly donate 10% of your income, I'm assuming you're a Christian. But very interesting, because they would have not been Christians growing up, but they've chosen to become a Christian as an adult. So that's actually very interesting. But still, you see that homeschool effect there. That's interesting. Sorry, tangent there. Okay, in terms of volunteer hours, again, this is as adults, so not when they were homeschooling, but as adults. Who volunteers in their congregations? Who volunteers in their church? Look at that. Your religious homeschoolers. Again, not a full standard deviation after controls, but before controls, almost 2 standard deviations. That's huge. Okay, in terms of playing a leadership role in those volunteer activities, again, standard deviation before controls, with controls, but half a standard deviation. Your total activity in terms of congregational activity, no difference between the public schoolers. That's interesting. And then in terms of missions and social service trips, that's interesting too, that as adults, the least likely are actually the homeschool religious, which part of me wonders, and this is me just speculating here, but I wonder if it's because the homeschool grads see their own country as their mission field. And I think presently in Canada, I think Canada is perhaps the most needy mission field in the entire world at the moment, spiritually. And I would speculate, again, I could be totally wrong, but I would speculate that's actually what's going on here, is when you're raised in a homeschool environment, when you become an adult, and again, I know so many homeschoolers who are now adults, and yeah, they're very aware that the world they live in here in Canada is a mission field. Okay, I try to strengthen my relationship with God as an adult. Again, who's the most likely to agree with that statement? The religious homeschool grads. As an adult, at some point, did you turn to God? They're not the most likely to say that, but there's almost a statistically significant effect. The most likely for that guy are the evangelical grads. Okay, do you share your faith with friends and family? They're not the most likely to agree with that statement, but they're right behind the independent Catholic schoolers. Do you share your faith with acquaintances or strangers? Again, more likely than public schoolers, not the most likely, and again, not statistically significant, but there seems to be some effect there. Okay, as adults, do you attend a small group for spiritual support, discipleship, prayer? Look at that, full standard deviation. Do you read the Bible by yourself? And this is based on frequency. So who's the most likely to do this? So let's just clarify that. Who, as an adult, is the most likely to read the scripture on their own? Religious homeschool grads. And you can see there was a clear homeschool effect, well above standard deviation. That's crazy. Okay, in terms of reading religious or spiritual literature beyond scripture, so in addition to scripture, again, most likely are the homeschoolers, religious homeschoolers, and there's again a full standard deviation there. And again, I love seeing the religious, non-religious homeschoolers there, because that means as adults, they look at that. They weren't raised in a religious home, but yet they were homeschooled, and they've chosen to discover the Bible for themselves. That's awesome. We're glad to see that, and the likelihood there. That's a follow-up research. That's follow-up research we need to do, Doris. Is how many homeschoolers that were raised in non-religious homes are now walking with the Lord. That would be a cool study.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thing. Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah. I hadn't noticed that before till this call, because usually I block, because usually I'm presenting to Christian or various religious audiences, and so I usually block out that bottom row. But no, glad we're looking at that. Okay, God called the respondent to a particular line of work in the view of the respondent. So the adult answering the survey, they believe God's called them to what they're doing. Who's the most likely to agree with that statement? Again, it's the religious homeschoolers. Wow. I have a job that fulfills my religious calling, whatever that is. Again, this one's not statistically significant, but they're the most likely, right there with the independent Catholic schoolers. Okay, they feel that their school experience, or K-12 education, prepared them for relationships as adults. That's what this question is asking. Who's the most likely to agree with that? Religious homeschoolers. So to the myth of socialization and that homeschoolers are not properly socialized, well, I beg to differ, because this is a representative sample that no, religious homeschoolers actually felt the most prepared for relationships as adults. They felt the most socialized. Now, it's not the case for the non-religious homeschoolers, and that is actually interesting. A quick tangent there. If we look at the homeschool literature and the development of the movement, if we go back to the 1970s, it was illegal almost everywhere to homeschool, which is crazy, but it was true. So if it's illegal to homeschool, and the consequence is jail time for mom and dad, and the kids be taken away, the only people that are going to homeschool in the 1970s are radicals. So whether that's radical Christians or whether that's radical non-Christians, it's those who have an extremely deep conviction, and they're like, screw the law. This law is unjust. I'm going to do what I'm going to do with my family. So what's interesting here is that's in the 70s. Moving into the 80s, you still have these two wings of the homeschool movement: those that are labeled quote unquote religious fundamentalists, and those then that are equally fundamentalist, but on the exact opposite side of the fence and very anti-religious. And you have a whole movement there. That was about half the homeschool population through the 70s and the 80s. And so what's interesting is those who are homeschoolers who are not religious historically have been deeply not religious, and capital L left in terms of what you would think of in terms of leftism. And I know that term's loaded, and wokeism and whatnot, but that, without getting to the weeds of defining those terms, roughly speaking, those would be fairly accurate labels, to the extreme of about half of the homeschool cohorts from the 70s, 80s, starting into the 90s. But it's once homeschooling is legal virtually everywhere, that's where it's now no longer culturally taboo. So you have more quote unquote moderate parents who are now willing to homeschool, and there isn't the stigma around it. So you don't have that kind of polarization. So in terms of a non-religious homeschooler feeling they're not prepared for relationships, that could feed into that socialization dynamic, in the sense that these are back to the earth people, radical hippie movement, that sort of stuff. So there is some literature there. There is something there to those arguments, but for those of us who do homeschool in the 21st century, in the year 2024, we are well aware that our kids are definitely the most socialized, because the interactions they have on a daily basis. Okay, they go to the grocery store with you. They're out and about. They're in the real world at a very young age, but not off on their own, vulnerable and alone. No, with mom and dad, with their siblings, and they live in the real world in a way that kids that sit in a classroom with other kids the exact same ages as them, the same kids every single day, who are from the same neighborhood as them. Like, when in your life are you ever going to be in the same room again where everyone is the exact same age as you, from the same neighborhood as you? That's not the real world. You'll never see that in the job. You'll never see that on the job. You'll never see that at church. You'll never see that anywhere ever again. So those at public school are in a genuine artificial bubble. It's this fake reality, and as a result, they're not that well socialized. Whereas a homeschooler, in an environment where it's illegal to homeschool, all those socialization tropes, they go back to the days of when it was illegal, which is frankly a long time ago. So I just want to highlight that here, where again, the religious homeschoolers, the most socialized of kids, the non-religious homeschoolers, as adults, looking back, there may be some legacy of those old days here, although I think that's very much in the past.
I want to add a couple of thoughts here. When you think about a child who's in a structured classroom all day long, when they come home, it might be 3:30 approximately. If they have a sport after school, or they come home and they're tired, they're drained, and now they're just put a show on before supper, and then it's kind of like roll into the evening routine, get them to bed. So they haven't really been out and about. With a homeschool child, they can do their formal, paperwork in the mornings, 2 hours, and then they have the rest of the day, and they can go out with mom or dad or a relative or something. And yeah, like you said, all those other points about being out and about and meeting regular people who are regularly working.
And who are you interacting with? Your child is interacting with people from all different walks of life when they're out and about, and at every different age group. Yeah. And that is the real world. Those of us who work for a living, we're always interacting with people who are a different age and a different background than us.
That's right. And I also wanted to add, like, they're prepared for relationships there. When a child is grown up in a religious home, there's a lot of conversation around what God says about marriage. And a lot of these families our children are around healthy families and healthy married couples around them. Not everybody, we know it's not perfect, but they see it and they like what they see, and maybe they want that too. But it's instructed in the home too. Like, this is how God's plan is. You know, when you become adult, you get married, not always, but almost always. And so there's also that sort of all the time, that influence every day of being around, you know, what God says about the family and about marriage. And so it's just natural for them, I think, to just assume that that's what they're going to do one day.
Yes, and it works. The success sequence is what it's called. And a paper that's coming out next week, I cite this, and there's research done both in Canada and the United States, looking at millennials who finish high school, get a full-time job, get married, and have kids in that order. There's an over 99% chance they will not live in poverty once they're in their 30s.
Wow.
So it's like, it doesn't matter what your background is, color of your skin, anything else. Like, if you have a basic education, you're working full time, you're married and with kids, and you do it in that order, you will be okay.
That's amazing.
And again, just simply, you do things God's way, you'll be well taken care of. Like,
Right.
yeah, exactly. But also the prepared for relationships. One final comment there. If you're part of a religious community and you're going to church at least once a week on Sunday and whatever other involvement there is throughout the week, there's a community dynamic to that. So so yes, there we isolate for the homeschool effect here, but as a religious homeschooler, even your homeschool experience is going to be different, because all that feeds back into homeschool. So even in terms of our social science and trying to parse things out and isolate for effects, the reality is you can't control for all of that bleeding, and the reality is a religious homeschool kid is going to be different, and in a very good way. So number of close ties as an adult, this one's unique in that the United States data is very different. And this is actually quite interesting. I almost wonder if this is anomalous, because this is actually inconsistent with all of our other research. This one finding in the United States, we asked respondents open-endedly, write down the name of your best friend and however many best friends you have, and there was, I think, a maximum of 7 slots. There were many people, public school grads, that literally could not write down a single name. They couldn't think of anyone to put in that open-ended question. The religious homeschoolers would fill all 7 slots, and then in a follow-up question, we'd ask what's the ethnicity of each of these best friends you have, and it was the religious homeschoolers that were the most likely to have a very close friend, a best friend that's of a totally different color skin than them. So that's also very, very interesting around, again, the socialization question in terms of close ties and who those close ties are. So this one, the Canadian data here on number of close ties seems to be an anomaly from this sample. Okay, likelihood of being married, there's no difference between the public and the religious homeschooler in terms of likelihood of being married. That's not the case for the Christian school grads. And I'm an anecdote that confirms this empirical data. I went through Christian school with my wife, high school sweethearts, married today. And then in terms of your marital status, the difference between those who are married and those who are divorced. This one, though, is interesting that there is seems like a very modest homeschool effect for the likelihood of being married, marital satisfaction, no difference, and then ever divorced. That's interesting in a negative. No, because okay. I'm so used to presenting this to Christian school audiences. Okay, the least likely to be divorced, this is in the negative, the least likely to be divorced are the Christian school grads. And there is almost a full standard deviation there for the school effect. The second least likely to ever be divorced are your religious homeschool grads. So sorry for the confusion there a second ago, but that is an important point. Now, it's not at a full standard deviation, so it's not statistically significant. So you have to take that with a grain of salt. But there does seem to be at least a modest homeschool effect in terms of reducing the likelihood of divorce as an adult. Okay, the days as an adult, the family eats a meal together. This is interesting. It's actually the non-religious homeschool grads that are the most likely, and by quite a margin. The days a family prays together, and again, those who are raised as non-religious homeschoolers but are now religious, wow. But of course, the most likely are the religious homeschool grads, 2 standard deviations after controls. That means like this is off the charts. Much more likely than a public school grad as an adult to pray together as a family. And then once you eliminate those controls, is that 3 standard deviations. So like, wow. Okay, days a family talks about God together. Again, almost 2 standard deviations after controls and the most likely. And then the family reading the Bible together, they're at a full standard deviation, although it's competitive with some of the others. And then I think this is our last one from this deck from this data. Satisfaction with family life. No one's at a full standard deviation, but there is at least a greater likelihood than a public school grad. But if we can keep going and look at it, to summarize all of this, the question: do graduate outcomes match parents' motivations? I think we can say yes. So the reason why a family would homeschool, a religious family, the reason why a family would put their kid in a Christian high school, yes. Although imperfect, and there will be for sure anomalies, and everyone can point to an example of where stuff went wrong. But in the aggregate, on average, speaking, again, in terms of the whole population, in terms of a full basket, yes. Definitely the graduate outcomes match parent motivations. Now, let's look ever so quickly at the share of enrollment. This includes your independent schools and your homeschool community. So those who are outside the public system in BC, it's the largest in the country at over 14%. That's important. And that is why, so the NDP government in BC, in their campaign platform of, if I'm not mistaken, of 01, 05, 09, and 2013, and this is from memory, so it may be slightly off, but if I'm not mistaken, those 4 platforms in a row, they called for the defunding of independent schools. And in their rhetoric, they definitely were not warm to the homeschool community. They came to government in 2017. The 2017 platform did not have any of that in there. And it's interesting that even as they've governed, I know they pulled back some of the funding for the distributed learning homeschoolers. It had been, if I'm not mistaken, at 75% of the public school share for distributed learning students, and it got pulled back from 75 to 50%. Again, I may be getting the details slightly wrong there. So there has been some pushback, but it has been nowhere near what their rhetoric was, say, 10 years ago. And I believe that's in large part because you have a critical mass. And from other research I have done, if you look at independent schoolers and independent school families and homeschool families, they're the most likely to vote and to be very active in the political space. That's not the case of your public school families. So there is a consequence electorally if a government is hostile towards the sector. So that critical mass is important, and also there's been incredible growth. Now, this is not provincial, this is national. So if we look Canada-wide, going back to 06, 07, which 06 was the year that I graduated from high school. And if we fast forward to the most recent year that we have StatsCan data for, so we can compare province to province, the growth you've had been 264%. And although sure, things have come down from COVID, you still have about a 70% retention rate from COVID. And we do know this is going back up. So the COVID effect, what wasn't just a flash in the pan, there's been a significant, huge retention rate, which is extraordinary. So incredible growth in the homeschool space. Also, of course, growth in the independent school space, while public school has been relatively flat. Okay, a few other studies, if we have time, Doris, to quickly jump into. This study here.
Time. Go.
Sorry?
You have time, you go. We love it.
Okay, super. So in terms of, again, looking at, we have the Cardus Education Survey now. Let's see if other research can corroborate this. This is a study that I worked with Catherine Pekalik on. So Catherine did her PhD in economics at Harvard, and she's now a professor at a very prestigious university. Her husband was a professor at Harvard for years, one of the most one of the top philosophers in the world, genuinely, very, very, very much so. I've never, Catherine, I would say without hesitation, she's the smartest person I've ever met by far, like just a genuine genius. And what she did here, she took a gigantic data set, so that you could tease stuff out of it that you can't tease out of other data sets. And what she wanted to find out is if we match the religion at home with the religion at school, does that religious fit in and of itself boost reading and math scores, the outcomes? And so, because what we're trying to measure is does the fit in and of itself matter? So of course that is a strong argument for homeschooling, and Catherine, by the way, homeschooled her kids. And a strong argument for homeschooling is the fit, that no, everything I want to teach my kid, all of the curriculum needs to be permeated through what mom and dad believe. And the faith that's at the home. There's a consistency in terms of what we experience at church on Sunday, what we experience in the home. There's an integrity where our lives there's a consistency and integrity to what we believe. That's important for the formation, most especially of the kid's character. That's obvious, and there is a lot of research on that. But does that in and of itself affect the academic outcomes? And we know from boatloads of research that academic outcomes are correlated with things like economic growth, things like longevity. Almost any desirable metric or any desirable outcome from a societal perspective is strongly correlated with academic performance, very strongly correlated, which is why there's so much pressure from society and from governments and from corporations, whatnot, to continually improve academic standards. It's just because the correlations are just off the charts and across the board. Okay. So if those correlations matter, what about religious fit? So let's look at that. So this is a very technical paper. So let's skip this data, and let's just put it in plain English. So here's our normal distribution curve that we talked about a few minutes ago. The fit effect in terms of the fit at school religiously and the fit at home religiously. The effect that has when we don't have controls in place, so we're not isolating yet, we're just looking at the raw effect, is between 14 to 19 percentile points, not percentage points, percentile points. So if you're at 14 to 19 percentile points, you're moving someone from within the average range to potentially into genius territory. Okay, or at least for sure, someone who's in the above average territory, you're moving them into genius territory. Someone who's way down here in whatever the opposite of genius is, whatever term we have for that these days, you're moving them at least into just within average or within the below average category to possibly within the average category. So once you put controls in effect and isolate just for fit itself, you're still at 4 to 9 percentile points. So again, think of what that means. If someone's at let's say they're the 95th percentile, okay, well you're now moving them from 95th percentile into like the absolute elite of the elite of the elite categories through fit. That's still huge. Okay, you're skipping over a full segment of the distribution. So hopefully that makes sense. The point being, you'll hear a lot of media commentary, or you heard a lot of media commentary around the pandemic and around learning loss. And there were a number of studies coming out predicting that this generation that was in school for the pandemic, life expectancy will drop anywhere from 2 to 10 years. Their life expectancy will decline simply because of how dramatically their outcomes, their academic qualities declined. For example, where grade 10 students presently are in almost every province in terms of where they're at in their math and in their writing and reading comprehension is where my cohort was at in grade 8. And in a few provinces, if I'm not mistaken, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Newfoundland, they're actually 3 years behind. So at grade 10, they're where my cohort was in grade 7. And my peers and I were nothing special. Like my age group, like they were not shouting about how amazing or how bright we were. There was nothing exceptional or extraordinary about us. We were so average, historically speaking, and frankly, we were coming down a bit from our parents' generation in terms of academic outcomes on some outcomes. And that's, we don't need to debate all the weeds of that. Point is, we weren't standout, but how steep the decline has been. And that decline was happening leading up to COVID, but it just fell off a cliff. So the consequences of that in terms of society, they're extraordinary. Okay, so how are we going to reverse that? So first, getting parents involved in the education process. And we barely scratched the surface. We only talk about much of that research, but bottom line is mother does know best. Mom is the most important ingredient in education by far, and followed by dad. So parents matter most, and involvement of parents, engagement of parents with their kids, that's the number one way to raise academic outcomes. Okay, and then secondly, religion. And having consistency between religion in the home, religion at church, and religion in whatever you're learning, the curriculum and pedagogy, all the rest of it, in terms of it being infused, just permeated with a Christian worldview, and fully tying back to what you believe and what you hold most dear. So and what your community believes in terms of community of faith. So all of those pieces, if we want to reverse the downward trend, those are the, statistically speaking, the two most powerful ingredients to reverse that. That's huge. That's huge. Okay. So then the question is, okay, well, how do you then get that message out? Because what I just said, I actually did say that at an academic conference. Was it 2 years ago? I think it was 2 years ago. And I was treated like a nut job. And I showed the data, and I stepped into the methodology. And this one professor, I won't say what university she's from, she's very well known. If you Google her name, she's very well known. It was as if I was like an absolute, just totally out to lunch. So I walked her through the methodology, show me where it's gone wrong, walk her through the data sets, and then walk her through the findings. And it is so foreign to their way of thinking. Like, she couldn't even begin to, like, she had to just at face value just say, no, there's something, this can't be right. This can't be right. And they won't even engage in the conversation. So even though I was on a panel, I was a presenter. Yeah, it was extraordinary. So there isn't an openness. So how are we gonna? How can we go about defending Christian education in the public square, and especially as a homeschooler? So the way that I like to address this, let's say it's not with a crazy academic who's locked in their ivory tower, but let's say it's a normal person. So your neighbor, okay, and you're having a barbecue with your neighbor, and the topic of, say, homeschool comes up. Like, what, you homeschool? Oh, and they think that's weird. Okay, ask the question: why do my property taxes pay for the education of Johnny down the street? And the answer the neighbor will probably give is, oh, well, the education of Johnny, or the lack thereof, profoundly impacts all of us. Society has an interest in the education of Johnny. Okay, so if the reason we're gonna tax every property owner, the reason we're gonna tax them is because Johnny's education matters, well, then shouldn't we be giving Johnny the best education possible? If we're willing to put a gun to people's heads and say, pony up, because ultimately that's what taxation is. You don't pay your taxes, watch what happens. Okay, so if we're willing to use force to make sure Johnny's educated, well, then let's make sure he's educated as best as possible. Okay, well, if with that kind of thinking, then we need to be asking the question, what's going to make Johnny a good citizen? The reason Johnny's being educated is because we think that's going to lead to good citizenship. So let's look at the literature. And if we look at every study, every empirical study that is reputable, where the methodology is sound, the reality is only 4% of them, and it's usually very niche what they find, usually one very particular thing, find a public school advantage in terms of the formation of citizens. The reality is the overwhelming majority of the literature, 96% of the literature, finds public schools do not raise the best citizens. So 38% find neutral effects, and then 58% find the independent schools raise the best citizens. Now, homeschoolers haven't really been looked at in this space, and it's because it's very hard to research homeschoolers. It's very hard to represent a sample. It's very expensive. But the independent school findings, frankly, you can almost put them on steroids for what the homeschool outcomes are, as we saw in the Cardus Education Survey. Because whenever we do those side-by-side comparisons, we're almost always, there are exceptions, but almost always where you find an independent school advantage, you find a greater advantage in the homeschool space. And again, we talked about socialization. There's that piece, but also too, what's the best form of education? There's lots of research on this. What's the best way to be educated? One-on-one tutoring. So if every single person has a one-on-one tutor, that's the best education experience possible. Okay, so homeschooling isn't quite that for most kids. For some, it might be. Homeschooling isn't quite one-on-one tutoring, but let's be real, the involvement of mom and dad is almost certainly to be greater and much greater in a homeschool setting than in any other setting. And it's in many cases almost like a tutor. So again, if there's all these societal benefits that are correlated with strong academics, even if mom and dad aren't a genius, it follows that those benefits of tutoring come through to the homeschool environment. So another way of teasing that out in terms of again, if Johnny's education matters, well, let's look at the pandemic. In some jurisdictions, schools were closed for over a year. I forget off the top of my head the full number of weeks closed. Ontario was particularly bad, but independent schools, Christian schools, they didn't shut down. The overwhelming majority of them, so 84% of them did not miss even 4 days. They moved online immediately and more than doubled the guidelines that the ministry gave. Half of them did not miss a single day of class. And then the question again, let's extend this to the homeschoolers. How many homeschoolers missed school because of the pandemic? How many homeschoolers missed because of the lockdown? There was no learning loss for the homeschoolers.
Life rolled along, didn't it?
Very much so. So in terms of who to communicate, I'm not interested in communicating and debating with public school advocates, because you're not going to win them over. And again, like the experience I had that academic conference, you're talking to ideologues. And there's no room for even a conversation or for a perspective, even if it's evidence-based, even if all the data is in your favor, logic is in your favor. There's no room even for a conversation. So I'm not interested in winning over public school advocates. Of course, private school advocates, you be preaching, and homeschool advocates are preaching to the choir. The broader public is who I want to win over. So what language works? I get away from the rights language, and the reason for that, rights matter. And again, I've had my work submitted to courts. I'm all about parental rights. I'm big on constitutional freedoms. You're not going to find a guy who's bigger on all that sort of stuff. But in terms of winning over the mushy middle, winning over your neighbor to why homeschooling matters, and because we can't take it for granted that it is legal. Like you're literally one government away from it, or one Supreme Court bench flipping the tables on you. And so it's important that we continually persuade the public, but you don't lead with the language of rights. We've done a lot of focus group research, and when you lead with that language, with those again who are in the middle, who are unaware of the issues, haven't lived your experience, there's an instant hesitation. Like, okay, why are you talking about rights? What is it you're trying to hide? What are you fringe? Like those who lead with rights, usually it's because they're not within the norms of society. At least that's the view of the mushy middle. So that's language not to avoid, but language to not lead with, if that makes sense. So in the 70s and 80s, that was the language, simply because that was the issue on the table, because homeschool was illegal. But by the 90s, the language moved towards choice, and into the 2000s, language around school choice. The problem with that language is that when it comes to children, especially when it comes to education, again, those who are just the general public, there is a hesitation to anything that's market-based language, because there's this instinct that your kid may be a widget, not my kid. and you may be able to use market mechanisms to optimize for your child, but not my kid. My kid is priceless. There's no measure to the value of my child. And so because of that, whenever market language is used, and there's much to be said for competition, when public schools have competition for students, you better believe the quality of those public schools increase. And again, the literature on that, the research is overwhelming. Market mechanisms, like when there's price at the point of entry, quality improves. When the person paying for something, when they're not buying it for themselves and it's not their money, there's no incentive for efficiency. That's why the cost, the money that goes into education just keeps rising and rising, but outcomes keep falling and falling. Like understanding how markets work and bringing that lens into education research, there's a place for that. That's important. It matters. But with your neighbor, that language doesn't work. It doesn't resonate. Okay. So the language that's at Cardus we learned to use was the language of outcomes. A tree is known by its fruit. A good tree is good fruit. A good well has pure water. A polluted well has polluted water. Look at the outcomes. Okay, if you want to criticize public school, don't do it from an ideological perspective. Just look at the outcomes. Are public schools teaching kids how to read? No, they're not. A third of kids can't read by grade 3. Okay. And historically, if you can't read by grade 4, you will not read until you're an adult. Why? Because the teacher keeps passing you along to the next teacher. They got 35 kids. They're not allowed to discipline. So they already have an unruly class. They don't have time to be teaching a kid at grade 5, grade 6 how to read, to give them the basics. Not a chance. And mathematics is even more cumulative. If you can't do addition and subtraction, you can't step into times tables and division. And if you can't do that, you're not stepping into algorithms and algebra and geometry. Forget it. Math is cumulative. You can't skip any steps when it comes to mathematics. So if a kid is just being passed along, and if 1/3 of kids, this is an accurate stat across Canada at this present moment, this is very recent data, 1/3 of kids in grade 3 can't read, 1/3 of kids in grade 3 can't do basic numeracy. That's the public school right now. So forget all the ideological stuff. You don't have to go there with the neighbors. Just look at the outcomes. Our kids, our schools forming good citizens. Is our society today less polarized because of public schools or more? It doesn't take a rocket scientist to put those two together. Okay. Public schools, the myth is that we need public schools for the sake of our civilization, for the sake of democracy. Okay, if public schools are necessary for democracy, when did democracy emerge historically? In ancient Greece? Were there public schools in ancient Greece? Okay, let's look at Canada's history. In 1867, how many public schools were there in 1867? Public schools didn't exist yet. So if these are necessary for the sake of democracy, how did this democratic country emerge without public schools? That's absolute nonsense. That's all myths. But you don't even have to go there. Just point at outcomes. And then in terms of the case for homeschool, point at the outcomes. And a very important caveat with homeschool outcomes is that homeschooling tends to be on an inverted curve. So we just looked at a few research studies here. If we really, if we had a whole week together and did a seminar, what we would find, and we take all the criticism on board. So take all the studies that have that hate on homeschoolers, look at all that. Let's look at all the positive ones. Let's bring it all together. What you'll find is an inverted bell curve. So where we looked at a normal distribution, a normal bell curve, homeschoolers tend to have an inverted bell curve where they're on the polar ends of almost every measure. Why? Because homeschool eliminates the average. There's no such thing as an average homeschooler, and that's not a bad thing. Because what happens in homeschool is you tend to become who you really are, and you're not trying to be anybody else. You're not trying to fit in with whatever crowd. You're going to gravitate to what you're naturally gifted at, what you're good at. And so for some kids don't need to go on to university. Frankly, the majority don't need to go on to university. And you see that in the homeschool data. Which graduates are the least likely to go to university? Homeschool grads. That's a fact. That's not a bad thing. Which graduates are the most likely to go on and get a PhD? As well, which graduates are the most likely to be top performers at top universities? Homeschoolers. So the most likely to succeed in university and to go really far to be top of the class, they're homeschoolers. But they're also the most likely to not go to university. And I think a big part of that is many homeschoolers go on to be moms, stay-at-home moms. And if you get married at 19, 20, 21, 22, don't finish university, you get married, start having kids, that's not a bad thing. Like that's like investing in the future of our nation in the most concentrated fashion, making the greatest contribution to our society. Children who are well-formed, well-grounded, productive, industrious, polite, thoughtful children, moms who do that. Okay. And the reality is mothers who cultivate civilization, and family, of course, is the bedrock of civilization. Who's the most likely to do that? It's homeschoolers. But you'll get academics and you'll get critics who will say, oh, but look, the least likely to go to university are the homeschool grads. Okay, but why is that? What are they doing? And that's also what comes through our data. Which graduates are the least likely to be employed? Homeschool grads. Again, why is that? Because you've got so many moms, right? They're stay-at-home moms. That doesn't mean again, that's not a bad outcome. Like my wife has a 24/7 job, 24/7 job with 4 children. It's insane how much work it is with 4 kids, let alone those who have more kids, right? That doesn't like. So she just doesn't show up in employment statistics. That's nonsense. Okay. So there's those who will cherry pick the data to point at homeschoolers in a negative fashion. But I would flip all of that. No, the outcomes are far superior. And again, it's on an inverted curve. So least likely to be employed, but the most likely to be entrepreneurs and employing others. Least likely to go to university, but if they choose to go to university, they're the top performers. They go and get PhDs. So that inverted bell curve that's very important. And also, too, what are we measuring? What matters? The priority of you and your family may not be the priority of whatever government or whatever academic or whatever media commentator. And in a free society, should that not be okay? So in conclusion, the last thing, again, in conversation with the neighbor over the barbecue, there's 3 things I like to emphasize that need to be held in tension. And this doesn't come from me. This comes from Jan de Groot and Charles Glenn was a prof for many years at Boston College, which is now Boston University. Brilliant guy. And he talks about 3 things need to be held in tension. Now, if I'm not mistaken, don't quote me on this, I'm pretty sure he homeschooled his kids. And I think he had like 6 or 7 kids, and he was a university prof. Brilliant guy, does a lot of great research. But he talks about how freedom needs to be held in tension with autonomy and with accountability. So if there is funding for homeschoolers that are public funds, taxpayer funds, every taxpayer dollar needs to be accounted for. So whoever the treasurer is, whoever the minister of finance is, and his staff or her staff, they have a fiduciary responsibility to know where and how those funds were used. It would be irresponsible for them not to. So if you're going to receive funds as a homeschooler or as a Christian schooler, there needs to be a certain degree of public accountability. And that's not something that should be resisted. Now, if there's no public funds, well then, bug off. That's a totally different dynamic. But if there's public funding, accountability must go with it. It's irresponsible for that not to be the case. So there's that. And then also autonomy. There's this thing called the freedom of association that is in our charter, and this goes back to common law. And this, I'm not sure if this one was actually in Magna Carta, but it's you're going to go back way in time to find the origins of the freedom of association. But the reality is, distinct communities are allowed to be distinct and autonomous, and homeschool communities are allowed to exist in their own co-ops. And frankly, it is criminal that many governments in this country do not allow homeschool cooperatives, where if there's a certain number of children that are present between the hours of, it depends on the province, but they'll actually set, like say 9 a.m. to like 4 p.m. or 3 p.m. or something. If there's more than 5 children together, that's technically by definition a school. Therefore, you have to be registered with the government. But again, stuff like that is nonsense. And that hasn't been challenged at the courts yet. And when you challenge something at the court level, you need to really do your homework in terms of who's on the bench, what are your arguments to know that you have a great chance of winning it. Because if you lose, that's a permanent loss. But the reality is freedom of association. We have a right to associate. And this, again, is where compulsory school laws are really incompatible with a free society. They truly are. and they are not necessary. The reasons why they exist, the claims for why they exist, are all bogus. Because again, take something like literacy. Literacy rates were well beyond 90% before you had any compulsory schooling laws. And so then that's a different tangent. Point being, freedom in terms of your parental rights needs to be held in tension with autonomy. That schools have rights as associations. Teachers need to be professionals, principals, that sort of stuff, right? So there is much to be said for that. And then if there's any funding, there's accountability. And I find it's very disarming when you're talking with your neighbor and they think you're just this crazy freedom person who all you care about is your own individual liberty at the expense of society. It's like, no, hold up. I believe in accountability, and I believe in freedom of association. I believe in autonomy, and I believe teachers should be professional, yada yada yada, all that sort of stuff. But I find this language of holding these three things in tension, there's a logic to it. It's disarming, and that is how I think, yeah, we lead with outcomes. And I think we could be persuasive in terms of the value of homeschooling. This is my contact info for anyone who wants to reach out. But yeah, and any questions, Doris, that you have, happy to take them.
Thank you. No, that was fantastic. And when you talk about outcomes, there's plenty of adults now who were homeschooled and through the 80s and 90s and the early 2000s. And we may not even know who they are, but they are being productive in society. They're contributors. They've holding good jobs. Some are post-secondary, some are not. Like just all those things you said, like I know oodles and oodles of these kids who are probably in their late 30s now. Some are even in their early 40s, and they're doing so well. And so, you know, we can talk about the early outcomes when they're still actively being educated, and we can talk about outcomes when they're adults. And I remember when my kids were little, there was a gentleman in my church who was just starting his family, and he always enjoyed talking to the homeschoolers. He says you can actually have a real conversation with them. And it's funny because that always stuck with me, because now when I meet children, and I may not know a thing about what kind of schooling they have, but I can spot the homeschooled kids. And maybe it's because I you know, raised my kids that way. I don't know, but they're not hard to find because they just socialize so well with adults.
And they know how to talk to adults. They know how to engage adults.
Yeah.
And how to engage strangers.
Oh, yes, no problem there. Which is
whereas again, if you're going to school all day, every day with the same people every day who look like you, live next to, the same age as you, like strangers are this foreign entity. Whereas for a homeschool kid, you encounter strangers almost every day.
Yeah, that's the thing. And they become peer dependent if that's all they've ever known is growing up in the same age group their whole lives. And you know, and then you have the whole negative socialization versus the positive socialization. Negative being in that group mentality, and the positive being individual and socializing, like we said, with adults. And even like a neighbor that might be 5 years older, a kid, or you know, your friend's sister, or who might be, you know, or the baby. They're comfortable with all ages, and that's what makes it really special. Yeah, I really noticed that in my kids. I also wanted just to add, when I interviewed HSLDA, that's the Homeschool Legal Defense Association. He was saying that during lockdown, and children were home for that long period of time, parents would, you know, be looking over the shoulder and going, oh, well, we could probably do that. And so those families who were sitting on the fence, wondering what should we not, you know, they went, you know what, let's do this, let's give it a try. And they chose to homeschool. And I don't know if it was like 2022, 23, but their survey said that in Canada, homeschooling doubled during that time. And so that's kind of cool to hear that. And just to put a little encouragement out there too, HSLDA has been out there since, I think they formed early 90s. And they were the front runners and still are fighting for freedom to home educate in Canada, and they work specifically with each province because each province's laws are a little bit different, similar, and some are different. And like you said, David, like we could just be a step away from losing it all. And so together, all of us always remember what we have and stand our ground and protect this privilege and joy to homeschool our kids. It really is a joy.
Yeah.
I was going to just put one cool question survey out there for you. It would be interesting one day, because we've got these older homeschool kids in their 30s and 40s now. The question in my mind would be, when a homeschooler marries a homeschooler, what does that look like in all those categories versus a homeschooler marrying a public schooler, or a homeschooler marrying a private schooler? And then all those outcomes, all those questions that you had there, what that looks like. It would just be interesting to see what that looks like.
Yeah,
on your
and I do believe I've come across, don't ask me to pull it up because this would have been at least 5 years ago, but I do recall coming across something that looked at when two homeschoolers get married. And yeah, the likelihood that they homeschool their kids, it's just beyond off the charts. Like it's all, I forget exactly what the numbers were, but I remember it was way up there. And so there are some that have looked at that question.
Yeah, I think of all the homeschoolers that I know that married a homeschooler, they are still homeschooling their kids now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And although some people have a poor experience in every one of these school categories, you can find horror stories. But again, the point of data. So the way a colleague of mine, Matthew Lee, brilliant scholar down in the States, he says qualitative data, so stories, anecdotes, tell you what is possible. But why data matters, quantitative data, is it tells you what's plausible. So what's the most likely case? What's the average? What's the aggregate? And that's again why data is so important. It's not the whole story. You can find anomalies on every end, and you can find amazing public school stories. There are some great public school stories, and there's some great public schools in Canada still, and amazing public school teachers and principals. I know many of them, but on average, on balance, in the aggregate, no, the outcomes just aren't there. And for homeschoolers, they are there. And you're right, the joy. It's tough the first 6 months and even the first year of homeschooling. If you've had your kid in a conventional school, it's at least for us, it was a tough bridge. But once you get through that initial hump, it's like exercise or diet, eating healthy food, right? If you've been eating garbage for so long, initially good food tastes terrible. Or if you haven't exercised ever, initially it's brutal, but once you find that it's healthy, it's wonderful, and the joy. You're right. You're totally right.
Oh, it is. And I always tell, it's usually moms that are, the primary home educator when they pull their child out of the system, whether it's private or public, because it's a classroom setting. So the kid is used to the structure and the recess bell and then the lunch bell, and they're just used to these routines. And so when the child comes home, both child and parent are learning, like, okay, it's different. Like, we have free time and there's only 3 of us at home versus 20 around me, and we're all different ages. And so mom is learning how to create structure and routine and discipline, and the child's trying to find their way in how this works. So I always say, like, you got to give yourself almost a month for each grade they were away. So let's say they were gone, they were in the system for 6 years, or grade 6. Like, you need at least 6 months. And I say, give yourself a year, and you may even need, the older the child is, you might even need half into that second year. If the child's only been in the system for, kindergarten, grade 1 or something, it'll go a lot faster because there's not so used to the way the system works. And I just want to, put that as an encouragement out there. When you're pulling your hair, parents, and you're just ready, like, to throw in the towel and going, I can't do this, nobody's listening to me, or I don't know what I'm doing, I feel disorganized, or whatever, that's okay. Everybody has a day like that. And There's always another new day. And if it's a bad day, it's a bad day. And you acknowledge it's a bad day and you start again the next day. And let me tell you, I homeschooled my kids K to 12 for 17 years. And we had some bad days, but my memory is all positive. And I remember when I have conversations, I remember things that were hard, but most of it was positive and deeply satisfying for the whole family. And the freedom of lifestyle comes along with that as well. Like when you want to do the formal schooling part, and school isn't always sit there and do your paperwork. There's all the projects that are fun that you can start after lunch, the outside stuff, the treasure hunts, the science experiments. It's just, I mean, I can go on and on and on, but anyways, I want to thank you, David. That was a fantastic presentation. It'll be very helpful and encouraging to a lot of people who are always worried about, like, is my child being socialized? Is my child going to be okay? Is my child going to turn out okay? Will my child like be smart? Will my child get to university? And my point to that really is, like, each year you can decide and watch your child as they develop, and then see if university is their path, or is a trade school their path, or is it going to be just, out there doing something else, even entrepreneur. Oh my goodness, what a gift. That's a beautiful career. And anyways, you've made us relax and know that socialization scores well with homeschoolers. And the research is phenomenal, really. Yeah. Do you have any closing comments?
No, not really. Thanks for having me, I guess would be my closing comment. Thank you for having me. This has been a pleasure. And yeah, to your audience, keep going.
Where can we find you?
So our website is aristotlefoundation.org. And yeah, my email, if you want to email me, dhunt@aristotlefoundation.org. Yeah, and we'll be producing stuff in a whole range of topics, but in the education file, we'll continue. There'll be a lot of stuff coming down the pipe. And then also Cardus.ca, where I used to work, and where a lot of this research, the overwhelming majority of this research comes from. Cardus.ca, Cardus.ca. They do amazing work. They're going to keep doing amazing work. I fully expect. And yeah, so check out both those websites, and there'll be stuff coming up on a very regular basis.
Wow, that was fantastic, wasn't it? So thorough, and there's just so much good information there to help parents make a decision whether to start homeschooling in the fall, or just to keep going and do it another year. And the stats show really well that homeschool kids are going to be well socialized. They're going to be great contributors to society as adults, hold jobs, and volunteer, be active in community, church, stay married, have children. And it's really just encouraging to hear this. So thank you, David Hunt from Aristotle Foundation, for presenting that to us today. And if you wanted to reach David Hunt, you can find him at the aristotlefoundation.org. And if you have any questions and you would like to reach out to me, you can email me at homeschooling@actionforcanada.ca. So thanks for being here. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again next time. Bye-bye.